Hi, everyone. I'm Zakaria, and I work here in the Office of Civics and Community Services at the Los Angeles Public Library. Welcome to today's program, the second in a series, brought to you by the USC Center for the Changing Family and LAPL. Today, Zsofia Szojka from USC will moderate a conversation with Kate Mangino, author of the forthcoming book, Equal Partners, an interactive guide to support building household balance in all partnerships. We'll have please send us your questions throughout the program, and we have a brief Q&A after the discussion. Take it away, Zsofia. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Zsofia Szojka from the Center for the Changing Family at USC, and today I will be interviewing Kate Mangino about her new book, Equal Partners. Kate is a gender expert who aims to challenge harmful social norms internationally as well as within the United States. This book club is a bit unusual in the sense that Kate's book is not out yet. So in addition to discussing the book, we will also ask her to read a few interesting sections. So Kate, before we move on to the content of the book, I found it very interesting that your background is in the international development sector. So could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how this book ties in with your previous work?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zsofia. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me today and for LA Public Library. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my book. So to answer your question, I believe that real social change happens when two things happen at the same time. You have to have, this probably looks a little strange on Zoom, but you have to have the the top-down approach. You have to have the policy that's working at the top, working down. And then you also need the grassroots level, the bottom-up piece. And when both of these are sort of working together in synergy, that's when you get social change. And I have huge respect for the policymakers who work up here, but my piece of the puzzle is sort of at the grassroots level. I'll just give you an example of one of my recent projects. I was hired to work with an organization who was working in Malawi to combat early childhood marriage. And they had identified religious leaders as potential influencers or change agents in the community. But we didn't go in and sort of tell them what the policy was and tell them they had to follow a policy. We really went in and had a dialogue. So first we did research to make sure we contextualized the issue. And then we arranged a series of meetings. They were each 3 days, and we did several of them over the course of several months. And we just brought religious leaders together in groups of 15 or 20 to say, here are some statistics on early childhood marriage. Is this happening in your village, and how do you feel about it? And then we introduced some case studies. This is what other countries are doing to address early childhood marriage. Do you think that would work in your communities? And then by the end, when we asked who is willing to do something about early childhood marriage, more than half of the participants were energized and excited to do something about confronting this harmful practice in their communities. So it was just, that's an example of social change and what it looks like when it works. And I think that all of my work, sometimes it's early childhood marriage, and sometimes it's women's empowerment, and sometimes it's HIV prevention, but it always boils down to discussing gender norms.
I really like it. Oh, I think there's some. Okay, now the echo is gone. I really like that you brought up this idea of a grassroots approach, because I feel like that really comes across in your book as well. So focusing on real stories by real people rather than just the big statistics. Of course, the big statistics are also very important, but this really illustrates it in a totally different way. And I was also wondering, how did the idea of writing this book come to you?
So for years, I mean, I'm sure every author says this, that it came over slowly over years. I was doing this work, and it kind of annoyed me that I was having very sophisticated gender conversations overseas and having very antiquated gender conversations at home, in the playground on Saturday morning with my kids, or at a picnic, with family and friends. So I knew for a long time I wanted to do something in my own community. And then I sort of had this, it was a meltdown. I'll just be honest with you. It happened about 5 years ago. It was 5 years ago. My kids were ages 2 and 5 when it happened. I was finishing my dissertation. My dissertation was on the connection between women's empowerment and masculinity's work. So I was very much in the gender field. As everyone knows who's been through this, you write for years, you research for years, and I was so close to the end. my kids were little. I was the alpha parent and I was teaching 2 undergraduate classes. So I was totally maxed out. And my advisor kindly brought me into her office to give me some feedback and then asked me to submit my final draft a month earlier than I had planned. So, yeah, right. And so I sort of held it together. I don't think I'd quite processed it. And I managed to get home without breaking down. But then I got home, it was night, my kids were in bed, and I just sat on the floor and I cried for a very long time. And my floor was so dirty. And I still remember sitting on the floor and thinking, I also need to clean my floor on top of everything else. And my husband was there and he was trying to be supportive. And he sat on the floor with me and he kept asking me, what can I do to help? I want to help you. And I just had this moment where my dissertation and my private life collided. And I just came out with this rush of data. And I just said, in dual working households, women take on twice as much of the work as men. And there's this thing called cognitive labor. And I let it all out. And I told him that I felt like I was being prevented from achieving professional goals because of my household burden. And I could see him slipping away from the kids because he put so many hours at work. And so thankfully he listened and we stayed up very late that night. And that sort of began our conversation about being more intentional, about being equal partners in our household. And it was after that day that I thought, I was prepared for that conversation because I happened to be writing a dissertation on that topic. But I wondered what other people did when they had their kitchen floor moments, because they're happening all over our country. And I kind of wanted to just create something that would put the statistics and the tools and the stories in one place so other people were also prepared to have those conversations. And that's sort of when I started thinking about the book seriously.
Thank you for sharing your personal experience, because I think it's really interesting to hear about this for me as well, that, I work in gender. So why do I have struggles? This question that, just because I'm an expert on a topic, it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect my life. So I think that's a really interesting perspective as well. There were a few things I wanted to follow up there about what you said. And one of them was, I think you used the term alpha parent. And what do you mean by that?
Good question. So when our firstborn, when we had our first child, I feel like Evan, I'll call his name is Evan, we worked really well together to be equal partners and equal parents. But then somehow when our second one came along, we slipped. And at that time, I was in school and teaching. So I had the flex parent or the alpha parent. I was the one that got a call when the kids were sick at school or daycare. And he had the 9 to 5 that came with insurance. And so I think a lot of people fall into these patterns that because I wasn't working any fewer hours than him, but I was, I think there was an assumption that I was going to pick up more slack.
I think the other term that you used, and I think this will come up later as well, but something that I really liked your explanation in the book is the idea of cognitive labor and our concept of emotional labor and cognitive labor. If you could tell us a bit more about that as well.
Absolutely. And I will not own the term cognitive labor. I borrowed that. I use it from Alison Daminger, who's she's at Harvard, and she's written extensively about cognitive labor. So I would encourage you to check her work out if you're interested. People have used double shift or emotional burden over the years. I like the term cognitive labor, and it's what I chose for the book because I think that it very concretely articulates what cognitive labor is, more so than others. Daminger takes us through this process. You have to anticipate needs, you have to research, you have to evaluate, and you have to, the third is make a decision, and the fourth is evaluate. It's this 4-step process that actually is very similar to project management. And it's that cognitive labor that really can weigh people down if you are the cognitive laborer of your home. And I think it's interesting that, there will be chore diaries and you can make note of how many minutes a day you do laundry or wash dishes, but it's very hard to quantify cognitive labor because I'm thinking about my kids' anticipated needs all the time in the shower, when I'm driving, when I'm trying to fall asleep, when I'm exercising. And I think that that's something that we haven't really captured in measurement yet, but it's very important.
Yeah, I think this term really speaks to me because I think you have this quote where you talk about it is harder to decide what to cook than actually cooking it. And this is a real experience in my life. And I wouldn't describe it necessarily as emotional. I do really think that it is cognitive and it really takes a lot of space in my head to have those kinds of plans.
Precisely. And, I don't, oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
In my story, when my husband kept saying when I was on the kitchen floor, what can I do to help? And I remember one thing I did say to him is, I don't want you to help. It is more work for me to identify ways that you can help than just doing it myself. I need you to step up and I need you to take on some of this cognitive labor. I don't need a helper in the house.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we will talk more about this when we talk about the different kind of partners. Before we do that, I just really quickly wanted to talk a little bit about those statistics as well. So what we mean when we talk about household inequality.
So data has shown us that now, I think in the last measurements were around 2020, that on average, women in double working households do twice as much work in the home as their male partner. So twice is actually a lot. That means if a man is doing 15 hours of housework every week, she is doing 30. It's considerable. And it's interesting that it isn't just among different sex couples. Data is now showing us also that in same-sex and queer couples, you also have one partner who is sort of defaulted into this female role, behavior and a male role behavior. So it extends past heteronormative relationships. And we often talk about the 65-35 split, that, and it really hasn't shifted much since the 80s. We've really kind of hit a plateau in terms of balance.
I think when you talked about your own life, it was really interesting that you mentioned that you feel like this is causing you to miss out on certain things in terms of your career development, but you also feel like your husband might be missing out on certain things in terms of his connection to the children or to the household. So how do you feel like this household inequality is harming women, and how is it harming men?
Great question. I'm going to start with the men because I don't think we talk about this enough. We, as in the greater we. Inequality is absolutely harming men. It is perpetuating this norm that men are the breadwinners, that men have to be financially responsible for their family. And it pushes men away from caregiving roles. And we have, great research that shows that men who participate in caregiving roles have benefits, that men's physical, emotional, as well as sexual health is improved when men participate in caregiving roles. And when they don't, we've seen instances of increased heart disease, we've seen substance abuse, we've seen depression. So having close emotional relationships, taking part in caregiving roles, not just for healthy outcomes, but just because they're joyful. And I feel like these gender norms are preventing men from having those experiences. So I always start off with saying gender inequality absolutely is not good for men. I think what we're more used to hearing is that it's not good for women, which I also obviously 100% agree with. And this has been going on for a very long time, but I think the pandemic really brought it out into the open. And I'm sure none of us have made it through a week in the last 2 years where we haven't read an article or heard a story about a woman who's suffering because once, if you're already operating at 100% and then you take away school and camps and daycare and play dates, you sort of crumble. And so I think we've seen the harmful physical and emotional aspect in women. And I think that we also know that it can prevent women from achieving professional and economic or income generation goals.
I think we're already starting to weave in one of the main topics of the book, which is about what men can do. So what are the things that men can do to change this situation? So I was thinking if you could maybe give us just a really brief summary about what the main argument and the aim of the book is and how it's different from other books in the field, because I do think that it's achieving certain goals that previous works haven't really done.
Thank you. So my work in development is very solutions-based, right? We identify problems and then we very quickly move on to what are we going to do about this. And so that's sort of how I wanted this book to be the same way. And there's there's, of course, lots of themes, but there's 3 themes that I tried really hard to weave into every chapter. The first is that a lot of writing up until now is aimed at working moms. And I think we're preaching to the choir, first of all. And I also think that working moms are maxed out. They do not have time to add anything else to their to-do list. I have experienced this personally, and most of my friends are in the same category. So I just think we need to change the conversation a little bit. And my book is really more about reinventing masculinities than it is about working moms. Of course, I would love it if working moms read it, if they have time to read this book, but I don't want them to be burdened with changing gender norms. Another theme that I think is important is this idea of a community response. I think for too long, we have looked at a nuclear household to fix this issue, sort of like, oh, you have an imbalance, that's your fault. But this is a problem that's been going on for decades, and it is going to require an intergenerational response as well. So, I think about people who might have a kitchen floor moment, and maybe their partner isn't there, but their mom might be, or their brother, or their neighbor, or their, friend. And I want to sort of give these tools to a whole community to better support gender equality and give lots of different people the words to influence an equal partnership. And the third thing that I think sets this book apart is the definition of partner. A lot of research to date has focused on married different sex couples with kids, and they're often white and they're often college educated. And so I intentionally tried to talk to lots of different kinds of couples, different sex, same sex, couples who identify as queer, couples who have kids, couples who don't have kids, couples who are cohabitating, couples who are married, just trying to have a broader definition of partner. Of course, every partnership is unique in its own way, but there are some universal truths that I think can relate to everyone.
Yeah, I think this is so important. We're definitely seeing an increase in different kinds of non-traditional and new family forms, and there's definitely a need to address those. And I really like your focus as well on couples who don't have children. I think they are often missed out of this conversation, like as if household duties would only exist once one has a child. But they're already there before. There's already lots of things that people have to think about in their household.
Yep.
So you started talking a little bit about partnerships and the different kinds of partnerships. And I think one of the innovative things about your book is first talking about the classifying partnerships a little bit.
Okay.
So talking about the male role in a partnership and how we can describe different roles that males have taken traditionally and they might be taking now. So if you wanted to talk a little bit about those different categories.
Sure. I sort of came up with these names, personas, behaviors, whatever you want to call it. They're a bit funny, but I think what I wanted to do is define the equal partner, but I couldn't get there without defining other behaviors too. And so I came up with these 3 personas. We have the king of the castle on one end. I think that's self-describing. Then we have the hands-on husband right in the middle, and then we have the equal partner. And I like to think of them as a continuum, because these behaviors, of course, aren't buckets, but there's all these points in between. And I say again that they're behaviors because I don't think people need to be stuck in a role. It's more to help us, classify how our behavior might be impacting the people around us. So I'll start. The king of the castle is, it's like Al Bundy. It's Don Draper. It's Homer Simpson. It's the guy that does nothing at home. He brings home his paycheck, however big or how small, and that is his job, and he is done. And he comes home and he enjoys his time. And whether his partner works or doesn't, it's really not up to him. And then you have the hands-on husband, which I think is probably the most common behavior that we see in 2022. And this is where that 35-65 split happens, because the hands-on husband is doing 35% of the household chores. He's not the king. He's so much better than the king. So we appreciate that. He changes diapers. He wears the baby Bjorn when he goes grocery shopping. He takes care of the pets, but at the end of the day, he's sort of the helper and his partner is the manager. And at the end of the day, he's not really taking responsibility for cognitive labor in his home. So I wanted to define the hands-on husband because I wanted to clarify that this is hopefully a milestone and we are not at our end goal. And then at the other end, you have the equal partner, which no matter what your gender identity is, the equal partner does half of the physical and cognitive work in the home. I know that that's not realistic day to day. I've gotten pushback. People have said, no one can be 50-50 every day. Of course not. I'm married. We all get it. No one wants to follow each other around with like a clipboard. It's more about looking at a relationship on the whole. Of course, there are weeks and months when one person steps up or the other one does, but it's sort of, if you look at it in terms of several months or a year, they're the ones that are really doing half of the work in the home.
Yeah, I found it really interesting when you talked about the generational shift to some extent, how in previous generations, the hands-on husband might be seen as ideal because he clearly does more than the king of the castle. He's very well-intentioned,
Right.
but then the cognitive labor is still falling on the female role or the alpha parent, as you were saying. So this difference between helping versus taking responsibility. And I think this year really comes back to this idea of cognitive labor.
Mm-hmm.
I think you were going to do a reading in relation to the equal partner.
Absolutely. So I can do I want to just talk or read a little bit about. So when I after I define these terms, then I think to myself, okay, I want to take an appreciative approach, and so I'd like to do the rest of this book is going to be focused on equal partners, right? We're going to leave the king and the hands-on aside because they're not the ideal, and let's try to normalize the behaviors that are ideal. So. I will start. Okay. We have become adept at calling out bad behavior and listing things that men can do wrong. This, of course, is important, but I find we lack examples of positive behavior that are at a, I find that we lack examples of positive behavior and are at a loss for words when asked to describe what men do right. For this reason, the remainder of part 2 will focus solely on the concept of an equal partner, with the specific intention of answering 5 questions. Where do these men come from? What is their inspiration? How do they do it? What are their partners like? And what lessons can we apply to parenting boys? In other words, raising a new generation of equal partners. The men I interviewed are not perfect. I am sure every one of them would want you to know that. They are human, they make mistakes, they can be selfish and stubborn, and they have arguments with their partners like everyone else. I am not putting these men on a pedestal. I am using the same words I would use for an equal partner of any gender. They are doing their fair share in the household, and that work is greatly appreciated.
I just really love this approach of focusing on this EP40 that you're talking about and these positive stories by men. I think it works so well. Sorry, was that the end, or were you going to still read more?
No, that was the end, and I don't think I ever explained the acronym. So for a long time, I know that the research I did cannot be assigned to the general public, right? I handpicked these people, and so to draw conclusions, I always talk about, I've kind of just made this term EP40, equal partner 40. It's the 40 men who I interviewed to be part of this data set. And so throughout the book, I talk about the EP40. And then when I interview their partners, I refer to that group as EP+. It's just sort of my shorthand way, so I wasn't using the term partner thousands of times.
Oh yeah, I totally forgot that that's not something that we use every day. In my head now, EP40 just equals fantastic man. So yeah, I will remember that this isn't everyone's common knowledge. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading these stories. They are really inspiring, but also remind me of many of the great men that I know, because I know from personal experience that there are men out there who really do everything they can to be an equal partner. And I think one of these stories that I really enjoyed was Alan's story. I was wondering if you would be happy to share that.
Absolutely. And Alan will be thrilled. I will let him know that you selected him. So let me go back a step. And in this section where I'm going to read a paragraph about Alan, I was looking for, where did they come from? It's like, where do these unicorns come from? Where, I was sort of hoping that I would find some sort of commonality between all 40. And I think we'll talk about this, but I didn't. And so what I did find were patterns of behavior that maybe 25 to 50% of them had. So in this section that I've starred is For example, let me give a couple of examples. One pattern I identify was around single moms. 10 or 25% of my EP40 were raised by single moms. And that was a life-changing experience in a very positive way for them. They described their childhood as being a team with their mom and their siblings and pitching in and working together. And that greatly influenced who they became as a partner later on in life. So that was one pattern, which I like to talk about because I think it's an awesome shout out to single moms. And of course, it could be applied to single dads or single parents in general, but these 10 happen to have single moms. The other one other pattern of behavior that I noted was caregiving. For those people who attended last month's session, I think this loops in nicely, but boys and teenage boys who were given the opportunity to be caregivers found that they liked it. And so they could intentionally make sure they were involved in caregiving roles as an adult. And Alan was one of those people. So let me read one of his paragraphs here about why caregiving was so important to him. Caregiving can also be life-changing when men experience it as a young adult. Alan identifies as white and grew up in Nova Scotia. He was the eldest of 4 boys and would look after his little brothers from time to time. But it wasn't until he got a job at a summer camp that he really had the opportunity to experience caregiving. My first few years, I was 18 or 19 years old, and the boys in my cabin were little, like 7, 8, 9. They were little boys. I had to remind them to brush their teeth, and at night I would tell them bedtime stories. When they got homesick, they needed hugs. And sometimes they would wet the bed. I learned really fast that I could either make that kid's summer awful, or I could pretend I spilled something and clean it up before anyone realized. It was an obvious choice. During our conversation, Alan realized those summers really normalized caregiving for him. I learned that being masculine doesn't mean being unavailable.
Yeah, this really speaks to me from the personal experience that I have also been a camp counselor, and I have met many of my friends in that context. And at that young age, being a teenager, I saw that many of my male friends who maybe in other contexts were really quite conventionally male role confirming, they have been these amazing sensitive caregivers to children. And I think it has really informed my thoughts about what kind of caregivers men could be and what kind of roles they can take on in relation to children. So that's why I really enjoy that story. I also really enjoyed the shout out to single moms because I feel like they have been blamed so much in society. And then just to remind us that, they can be really inspiring to the boys that they have raised, and they can be a solution sometimes rather than this myth that they aren't able to raise men. So I really like that.
I think that there's a misconception that to be an equal partner, you should come from that kind of a household. And that's not what I found at all. I found maybe 2 of the EP40 had parents who demonstrated an equal partnership. So it does not have to come from your parents at all, which I think is a good reminder that it can happen from anywhere.
Absolutely. And this really leads us to that next question as well. I think you've already mentioned this a little bit, but just in a little bit more detail. So if it isn't from a role model of their parents' relationship, then where do these men get these attitudes from? How do these develop? These attitudes that are different from what we consider to be the majority male perspective.
So I was really disappointed, to be totally honest. When I finished my research, I thought for sure I was going to interview these people and I was going to identify some commonality, and that was going to be what this book was about. And I couldn't, there was no commonality. I would have been making it up. And that was disappointing at first. And then I thought about it in a different way and sort of flipped it upside down and thought, well, the nice thing about that is there's no single path, which means anyone could be an equal partner. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter who raised you. It didn't matter if you had a happy childhood or a traumatic childhood. There's lots of different families out there, and wherever you come from, there's an opportunity to be an equal partner. And I think that message is actually lovely once I got over the fact that I didn't identify a single pathway. And let's see, I do have a few paragraphs here.
Oh, great.
Okay. Based on the EP40 interviews, life experience does not need to be determinative. Lucas came from a very challenging childhood characterized by poverty, trauma, and violence. Martin spent weeks of his childhood at a shelter with his mother and his siblings, hiding from his abusive father. Remy came from a household surrounded by men who exhibited toxic masculinity. Isaiah described the men from his childhood as tough and emotionally distant. Yet all of these men are now the people they want to be and not the people society raised them to be. Help is certainly important. Lucas and Martin give credit to programs run for nonprofit organizations. Remy and Isaiah credit their mothers for showing them how to love and to be loved. All 4 of these men were recipients of kindness and patience and empathy during their lifetime. We should not assume people can break cycles and become equal partners on their own. But we should also not assume people cannot be equal partners because of their background. Knowing this, I have little patience when I hear men use the line, "It just isn't the way I was raised," as an excuse for doing less in the home. I think of men like Lucas and Remy and Martin and Isaiah and how hard they worked to be who they are today, and I realize how empty that excuse really is. The glass ceiling is a common metaphor used to describe the unseen limits society puts on a woman's professional ambition. But maybe we need to start using the term glass ceiling for men too. The metaphor is an excellent description of the way society protects men from household work by lowering our expectations of them, which prohibits them from doing more. I think we need to think differently about men as partners and fathers and stop putting limits on male capacity. Anything else is, ironically, patronizing.
I really like that, and I think I like it from both perspectives. So on the one hand, talking about how this means there's no excuses really, but also talking about the potential on the other side, right? That coming from traumatic family experiences doesn't mean that we have to repeat those patterns, and that everybody has that potential to create the kind of family that they would like to have and that they believe is equal. So I think that's really important.
Thank you.
I think we talked a bit about now, so where these men come from, what kind of experiences they had before, but we haven't really discussed what their motivation is, so why they are doing this. If you think about male privilege, so the idea that men don't have to do as much as women do in society, why do they reject this privilege and choose to do more?
So this is fascinating for me because my original interview protocol had this question in it, sort of why the patriarchal dividend, right? Like, why are you rejecting your patriarchal dividend? And I have to say, I stopped asking it because the EP40 don't think they're giving anything up. They think being an equal partner is a privilege, and they flipped it totally for me and just said, there's nothing that I'm not missing out on anything. I don't miss privilege that I thought I had. I am happy. I have amazing, emotional, connected, fantastic relationships with my partner and my kids. I can be myself. I don't have to pretend to be someone else in my own home. I don't have to put on pretenses. I can be vulnerable. I can be authentic. They feel competent, and they're really proud of themselves for being competent. They're proud of themselves that they know they can take care of their kids if something were to happen to their partner. And yeah, I would just say that it's sort of opposite, that the EP40 see being an equal partner as privilege.
Yeah, I feel like this is really going back to that idea that gender inequality harms men too, and that having an equal partnership can be a source of happiness. So I really like turning this idea around from what are you losing out to what are you gaining? How is it a privilege to be an equal partner? I think we talked quite a lot about how there isn't a single pathway of getting there. Not all of these men have had the same experiences. And I think within that, it would be really good to emphasize the roles of race and class as well, and how they might affect someone's journey into becoming an equal partner.
Absolutely. I was very intentional about making sure that half of the EP40 were men of color and came from a variety of different backgrounds. So I interviewed men who are shift workers as well as men who have, the 9-to-5 office job. I have 1 or 2 men with a PhD and many who have a high school diploma. So I tried to get lots of different perspectives. And race and class absolutely had tremendous impact, of course, on upbringing and who they are today. And I think that that's a conversation that we needs to be central when we talk about gender. And the one thing, everyone has their own unique situation, but the one thing that was consistent that I heard from many men is that it wasn't their self-identity so much as it was how other people saw them. So the assumptions people made about them because they are Cajun or Appalachian or Black or Hispanic, right? And so that came across loud and clear. And this is the last reading that I had tagged, but if you don't mind, I thought I could read about James and Will because they talk about this sort of pointedly. Okay. And then I'll stop because I know I'm reading a lot. Okay. So we met James. James was introduced earlier in the book, but we met James in chapter 5. I think I'm in chapter 6 at this point. He was the man whose father taught him the principles of Black nationalist philosophy. When I broached the intersection of gender and race, James brought up the myth of the absent Black father and how that has affected him as a parent. I don't want to play into the stereotype of the deadbeat dad, which is the narrative in Black communities as well as the nation. I find myself overcompensating to not be that guy, or at least to not be perceived as that guy. James does not buy into the myth himself, which is good because that is exactly what it is, a myth. The Centers for Disease Control published a report back in 2010 demonstrating that of all American fathers, Black fathers are the most present in their children's lives, whether they live with that child or not. But that doesn't matter. The mere presence of that narrative in American culture is enough to force James to rethink who he is as a father. Will identifies as Polynesian American and was born and raised on the West Coast. He grew up in a predominantly white community and felt pressure to be a model minority. Those were his words. As one of only 2 non-white kids in his high school, Will was careful to behave as he was expected in order to be accepted in white circles. It did not surprise me when Will said that he did a lot of performing growing up. Like others, Will spoke about how his experiences as a child have manifested in his adult behavior. I was well aware that I was one of 2 brown kids in a white society. I knew that no matter how good or how smart I was, people would still assume I was stealing or up to no good. So I always had to be on the defensive. To this day, I do an Iron Man scan when I'm in public with my kids to make sure I know where the exits are, making sure I could protect them if I needed to. Will also spoke of being concerned about how he is perceived in public. He told me that his skin is dark, but his son is fair and presents white. And his son is a person with autism and prone to public outbursts. It happens a lot when I'm out with my son and he gets angry, and I have to physically restrain him and carry him out to remove him from that particular situation. And every time I think it is just a matter of time before someone calls the police, and then police are going to get involved on top of this already very difficult situation. It goes back to when I was a kid. No matter how good of a dad I am being, people always assume the worst in me.
Yeah, I find this last part in Will's story really emotionally affecting. And it really makes me think about how, these men, they already have to face a certain kind of societal judgment about not conforming to the traditional gender norm, but that these challenges are massively exacerbated for men of color. So I think that's really important to talk about.
Yeah.
And then I noticed that actually we're kind of, a lot of time has already passed and we want to leave time for questions as well. But I definitely wanted to talk about, I think one strength of your book is to talk about practical solutions as well. And that is obviously weaved in throughout the book rather than just at the end, which I think is really good. But because of that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what can we learn from these men in terms of practical steps towards achieving equal partnership. How does it happen?
I think that the number one lesson I learned is that it doesn't just happen by accident and it doesn't happen with one conversation. It happens over time, and it happens because they are intentional about gender. There is no magic bullet. I think that social change it takes time, and it takes dialogue, and it takes a willingness to be uncomfortable sometimes. I think of it in sort of 3 steps. I think that whatever we saw with the EP40, it was sort of a 3-step process. Number 1, you have to be open to the fact that you can be better. If we think of ourselves as perfect, if we have a gender degree, in gender studies, or we feel that we're woke enough, then we're not going to be open to being better and changing. And I think that's a really important first step. Then second, I think we all need to work to see gender a little bit better. There are probably dozens of situations in our everyday lives, every day, dozens of examples of gendered behavior. People say something or they do something or they make an assumption. And we have to sort of train ourselves to see that. And I think that's harder for men to train themselves to see it, because I don't think they were raised to see those gender inequities, and that takes some practice. And then finally, once you see it, we have to do something about it. So it's changing our words, it's changing our actions. I just had a really interesting conversation over the weekend. I saw some research, I don't know, months ago, and this person had also seen the research, and it was just this exciting moment where we were both excited that we had the same idea. But when you're addressing a group of children, there's fantastic research to say that we should not use the term boys and girls anymore. Right? That reaffirms the gender binary, and it forces children to think about, where do I fit or where don't I fit? That if we simply changed our language to say, hey kids, or hey friends, or hey campers, or students, come over here, that can make a huge difference. So I have lots and lots of little ideas throughout the book, and at the end, of ways we can change our language and behavior, nothing that takes time, nothing that takes money, just little incidences every day. And I think it's paying attention to the little things that's going to make the biggest difference.
I think that really resonates with me, this idea that, we're not really looking for an already perfect equal partner, and that doesn't even mean the same thing to all of us necessarily. It is something unique to each relationship. We're looking for someone who's willing and able to change, and that's probably the same on the other side of the equation as well. So yeah. I think that really talks about how good partnerships and functional partnerships happen. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the time of the conversation when I would really like to open up to questions as well. I can already see that there are some interesting questions in the comments, but if there's anyone who has any more questions, then feel free to add it. And I think we will have some time to address them, which is amazing. I had many questions about Kate's book when I read it. I think we talked about most of them already, but I'm sure you also have some interesting questions. So the first one that I can see is from Susie. And the question is, how did Kate find the 40 EPs?
Good question. It was harder than I thought it was going to be, which was a little bit disconcerting. I did a snowball sampling. I started with friends and colleagues and people who were in the gender field, because they could understand very quickly this sort of person that I was looking for, and they would make some recommendations. There were many times when I would talk to someone and explain what I was looking for, and they would say, gosh, I don't know anyone like that. Every single couple that I know kind of has more of a traditional role. But after I got the first, 5, 6, 7, then I would ask those people to recommend others, because the EP40 were pretty good at identifying other men like them. So I just sort of followed a snowball sampling, and I ended up hitting pockets of people. I hit a pocket in Texas, and I hit a pocket in sort of the Pacific Northwest, and a pocket in Southern Louisiana. And so that was really nice to get differences of opinions from around the country.
I was just going to say that I think it makes a lot of sense to me that people who are men who are equal partners would also know other men who fit that category. And it made me think about this part in the book when you talk about the role of community support, mm-hmm. And how important it can be to have the support of other men who think alike for these men. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really interesting as well. Thank you. I'm looking at the comments. I can't see other questions right now, but if any of them come up, I will talk about them as well. But then I might ask some of my questions until we get some more. I think, so my background is in developmental psychology. So throughout reading the book, I always thought about the children, even though I do think it's important to think about childless couples as well. And I'm really interested into how male or female children come into the equation here. What can parents teach about their children in terms of what an equal household looks like? And what should we expect from children in terms of contributing to the household tasks? Do they have a responsibility in terms of not letting the female partner or their parents have all of the cognitive labor and all of the household responsibilities?
So I had many EP40 who had to take part in household chores as kids, and I had many who did not. So again, I think there's no single pathway. I don't think it can hurt to include kids in chores and household work. And I would just say that, of course, we should be intentional about making sure we're not assigning gender assumptions to those chores, not, assuming that your daughter is going to clean the kitchen and your son is going to mow the lawn, right? To make sure that you switch it up and not perpetuate gender norms in terms of chores. Chapter 8, specifically, for those of you who might be interested in reading the book, is dedicated to EP40 and EP plus stories that can be applied to the next generation and working with children. And there's great ideas in there about teaching empathy and helping kids be authentic. And the one thing that came out that goes back to my sort of message about the community that I'm really excited about is anyone, and this also goes to your work, Zsofia, is you don't have to be a parent to have a huge impact on kids. And I think, again, we expect this nuclear family. We expect the parents to be the ones doing all the work. And the EP40 were inspired by all kinds of people. They were inspired by teachers and coaches and pastors and friends. And one was inspired by an uncle he saw 1 week a summer, and another one was inspired by a camp counselor who he only met one summer. And I think that just goes back to show us how important community is. If you have a child in your life, whether it's because it's a neighbor kid or kids in your faith community or kids in your classroom, all of us have the potential to be inspiring to children because you never really know where they're going to pick it up.
I like that we're going back to the theme of community because I can see that the next question we have also relates to that theme. So CM Beckman, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says that in some of my research, the EP men are lonely because they don't have these pockets of support. Can you talk about their social networks?
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think that it can be lonely. I think about all of the networks that are available to moms. It's something that has been in our structural culture for a long time now. I am on community chat groups. I am in school chat groups. Like each of my kids, their grade has a chat group. They now call it a parents chat group, but to be honest, it's 95% women who are participating. And I think that serves two purposes. It serves the purpose of sort of emotional support, right? I have all of my friends on text who, if I serve peanut butter and jelly for dinner, I can say like, I'm a stellar mom serving up PB&J for dinner. And I immediately get 10 friends who are like, no, you're great. PB&J is fantastic for dinner. Don't worry about it. So you get affirmation from those groups. And you get information. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have to text and be like, is tomorrow pink shirt day? Or is that Friday? Or is there early dismissal today? Or when are we supposed to bring in canned food again? I can't remember. And you get instant replies. And there are not those networks for men traditionally. And so I do think that men can feel lonely and isolated. I spotlighted a group, Dad Guild, which is in Vermont. And I interviewed the coordinator, Keegan Albaugh, for that, if you want to check them out, or if anyone's listening from the Vermont area. And he's trying to combat that very thing by bringing men together and starting dialogue so that men do have that network of support. Fathering Together is another fantastic organization that's national. Actually, now it's international. It's a Facebook group. You have to identify as a dad to join. And it's a way for dads to connect. So I do see this changing, but it's changing slowly. And I think that maybe we can help this along by creating and supporting more dad networks or networks where everyone's welcome, right? More networks that are truly parent networks where everyone is welcome.
Yeah, it's fantastic to hear about these groups. And I think that they are real engines of change in terms of normalizing that kind of behavior. And there was a follow-up to this question as well. Partly this might be, so I guess this is talking about the loneliness, might be explained by the fact that my EP was a stay-at-home dad. Mm-hmm. I didn't see any in the dual working couples, unfortunately. So that made me think about, were any of your respondents stay-at-home dads, and what were their experiences?
I had two stay-at-home fathers that I interviewed in the cohort. I was trying to find dads who work because I was really focusing on this dual working family situation, but I did interview two stay-at-home dads. And I do remember one telling me, explicitly, he felt really confident with his decision. He never had second guesses about, did I do the right thing? He thought that he needed to provide for his family, not financially, but in terms of time and care. But he was embarrassed sometimes when he talked to other dads, and he didn't have a lot of other dads to sort of get together with. And I think this very much depends on where you live. If you're in New York City or LA or Chicago, there's probably plenty of stay-at-home dads for you to hang out with. This man is from West Virginia, and so he didn't have a lot of, he worked in construction before he decided that his wife was clearly the earner, and it made more sense for him to be at home. And, I remember him telling me, the quote was, I said, do you tell other people, other dads, are you comfortable doing that? And he said, well, I don't put it on a hat, I'll tell you that much. So I thought that was a good reply. Like, he's like, if someone asks me point blank, I'm not going to lie. But he said, I never ask anyone else about their work because I don't want to answer that question myself. So I think that gets into what the person who asked that question. I do think there's probably a great deal of loneliness for a lot of stay-at-home fathers.
I think the comment also highlights, though, the challenges in dual working couples in terms of, having to be flexible and scheduling tasks day to day as well, rather than having these fixed roles. And that might be, I don't know, this is just a guess, but that might be why people are saying less of these EP men in the dual working couples, because it can be really difficult to get that kind of balance, right?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting as well. Any further questions? Not right now. I will keep monitoring it in case anything else comes up.
Okay.
And I think this is pretty much my last question, and it has to do with what we're looking towards. So I think you talk quite a lot about generational differences and the shifts that we're already experiencing. But what do you think is the future of household equality, and what would you like to be the future of household equality, if I can separate it that way?
Right. I'm not going to make any. I'm not going to make any prophecies. That seems somehow irresponsible. We have seen projections. Men Care, for example, International Fatherhood Network made projections, and I think it was, if we carry on in the patterns as we are now, then we might see gender equality in the next 175 to 250 years. It was long after any of us are going to be around on Zoom. And it was a bit depressing. So I guess my hope is that we speed up that timeline. And I think that where I not lose people, but, I guess the message I want to send is that there's no judgment. I'm actually not advocating for a dual working family. I think all families are amazing. Being in a family is hard. Working and having kids and having pets and taking care of elders is hard. And so however anyone does it is great. If it's working for you, that's fantastic. I would never judge a single parent household. I would never judge a household where one parent stays home. And I think that, but what I do want to point out is that the dual working family is the most common family structure in the United States right now. And we just know that from demographics. And so knowing that, if you're not in that structure yourself, then you probably are friends with someone who is, or it's your sister or your brother or your cousin or your neighbors. And if we could all get a little bit better at the language that we use and realizing that we all can influence the next generation and we all have a part to play, that no one really gets a hall pass for this one. I guess the message I would like to leave you with is that it's not just for nuclear families. It's not just for double working households with kids. It really needs to be everyone's, on everyone's agenda, and that we would welcome the work and the participation from grandparents and neighbors and friends and anyone else who's willing to support gender equality.
Yeah, I really liked going back to this idea at the very end, wrapping up with the idea of community support and what everybody can do. And also that, yes, there isn't just one model of doing this, but it's a very real problem for very many people who really welcome change in this field. So I think it's a very important book. And I would absolutely recommend reading it if you get the chance once the book is out. I think this is a good point to wrap up. I wonder if there was something the library was going to say at the end.
Hi, yes. I was just going to say thank you both for a great conversation.
Thank
For
you,
more
Kate.
information on Kate's book, you can go to Yes, there we go. Kate's book. Read.macmillan.com/LP equal partners. And also, I wanted to let everyone know that next month, Tuesday, April 12th, we have the third and final installment in this series. It's a moderate discussion with Jessica Nordell, author of The End of Bias, The Beginning, which examines biased behavior through scientific research and shares approaches that have brought proven change. And there's more information on the whole series on our website. It's www.lapl.org/maternal family health. And that's the website. And thank you both once again, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Zsofia.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah.